Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. We have a critical mass of folks here today, and I'll be admitting people into the meeting as they come in. Welcome to the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative Winter webinar series. This is the third and final of 3 talks presented by researchers engaged in the science and practice of prairie reconstruction. My name is Jamie Ellis, and I work as the Natural Areas Coordinator at the University of Illinois, Urbana Champaign, and I serve on the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative Advisory Team. So thank you for joining us today. This session is being recorded and will be available through the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative website and YouTube. I kindly ask that you keep your connections muted during the session. If you have questions during the talk, please type them into the chat. I'll read through them at the end, and our speaker will do their best to answer them. Before I introduce our speaker, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative. We are a community of prairie practitioners and researchers from more than 30 organizations working together to improve prairie reconstructions so that they are biologically diverse, are ecologically functional, and resist invasion by non-native plants. We focus our activities within 2 general areas: evidence-based tools and peer-to-peer learning. Our tools include a vegetation monitoring protocol and a prairie reconstruction database designed to collect a standard suite of data about reconstructions. By pooling and analyzing data from many reconstructions, we hope to reveal pivotal elements that will increase the likelihood that all reconstructions meet expectations. Our learning opportunities include both in-person and online events where members of the prairie reconstruction community can exchange experiences and knowledge. We believe these insights from both individual experiences and scientific investigation lead to our collective success. And thank you very much to Amanda for putting a link to the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative website into the chat once again. Would be great to keep yourself muted, and then also if you have questions along the way, put those into the chat. And at the end, I'll go through those, and our speaker today will be very happy to answer and discuss. So I am very pleased to introduce Justin Meissen. Justin leads the research and restoration program at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. Justin's focus is on implementing restoration research and demonstration projects, developing training seminars, and leading the ecological restoration efforts at the University of Northern Iowa's 300-acre Irvine Prairie.
Now finally loaded.
He has a PhD in conservation biology from the University of Minnesota and a bachelor's of science in integrative biology from the University of Illinois at Urbana Champaign. His past work evaluated the risks of repeated intensive seed harvest from native tallgrass prairies to supply large-scale prairie restoration. Justin's current research interests concentrate on issues of increasing cost-effectiveness and outcome certainty in prairie reconstruction. So with that, I would like you to help me welcome Justin today, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that he can share his. There we go. And Justin, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thank you, Jamie. Just make sure you can hear me. Everyone can hear me good.
Yes. Yeah, you're coming through loud and clear.
Very good. Okay, so I'm gonna keep my camera off since I'm at home today. We've got a bunch of ice out there here in Iowa, so um, try to keep my connection as stable as I can. So yes, I'm Justin Meissen, the Research Restoration Program Manager at UNI's Tallgrass Prairie Center. And today I'm going to talk about how some of the key decisions made when designing and implementing some popular CRP plantings influence how successful they turn out to be. Um, so I'll be framing this talk a lot in terms of specific agri-vegetation programs, but I think you'll see as we work through it, the results are directly applicable to prairie construction in protected lands as well. So as we go along today, we'll also highlight how the practice of ecological restoration compares to current practices farmers use and how things might be improved at the field and decision-making scale. Right. Oops. Okay. So to start off, just kind of give a brief introduction to the Tallgrass Prairie Center. We're an organization based out of the University of Northern Iowa, and our mission is to empower people to value and restore resilient, diverse tallgrass prairie. The center was born out of Iowa's native roadside vegetation program back in the 1990s. And since then, it's grown in scope to multiple programs. Program I manage is the Research and Restoration Program, where we focus on doing applied prairie reconstruction research. Some of the other programs that we have are our plant materials program, which is focused on getting source identified native seeds onto the commercial seed market. Then we have our Iowa roadside management program, where we support managing native vegetation on roadsides around the state. And then finally, our most recent program, the Prairie on Farms program, where the objective is to integrate prairie into agricultural landscapes. And today we'll be talking about research which is related to a lot of the aims of that. So to jump into our topic here, land use intensification, rising production inputs, ultimately stemming from the conversion of tallgrass prairies to agriculture, diminished most ecosystem services in ag landscapes throughout the Midwest. Reduced pollinator abundance, deteriorating water quality, soil erosion, they've all become large-scale stressors facing our ecosystems. So in response, many organizations have developed targeted programs to address some of these specific conservation challenges. One of our largest examples in the US, certainly in the Midwest, the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP, as I'll be referring to it for the rest of the talk, has created a lot of different conservation practices designed to enhance specific ecosystem services in agricultural landscapes. Upland game bird provision, erosion control, flood control, those are all targeted services with specific programs associated with them. And on the whole, they're implemented through contracts with private landowners to revegetate post-agricultural land and then manage those stands. Historically, the implementation of those programs has been pretty simplistic with respect to the kinds of plants that were used for revegetation. Using more than a handful of species, let alone native species for revegetation in the past really wasn't very common. But more recently, in the past 2 decades or so, we've seen these programs take on more complex issues with aspects of ecosystem rehabilitation included in their targets. Things like rare and declining habitat restoration and pollinator recovery have become components of popular practices in recent years. More and more of the revegetation projects being deployed are requiring diverse native vegetation now. The most significant of them have been, I would say, the pollinator and wildlife habitat related ones. with the prime example of that being the Pollinator Habitat Initiative that was initiated around 2014. And that practice specified creating long-lasting, high-quality meadows of native wildflowers that support pollinators and other wildlife, which you'll recognize as having some very strong resemblance to tallgrass prairie reconstructions. Um, and you can see here on the chart that how fast this adoption of prairie practices has been in Iowa up until 2020. This is just focusing on those two I talked about earlier. Um, and then starting with signups in 2020, we now have another USDA conservation practice, the prairie strip practice. We just talked about the use of these sort of high diversity stands, and these prairie strips are very flexible in association with that because they're very easy to integrate into farm fields. Because of that flexibility, it has a lot of potential to be widely adopted, and through that, it could make a significant impact on the ecosystem services in landscapes in Iowa and the Midwest more generally. So, given how popular CRP using the somewhat diverse native vegetation has become, these kinds of practices have a lot of potential to be widely adopted by folks without a lot of experience planting native vegetation. And given the potential for so many of these new adopters, it's important to ensure they can succeed with their first experience, since that's going to help secure long-term buy-in for these programs or expansion of the practices. So because many farmers and landowners, they're new to establishing native vegetation, they have to rely on secondhand forms of information like practice implementation guidelines. Ultimately, those guidelines need some strong scientific backing before we can really feel confident about recommending them um, and expecting a successful outcome to result. And much of that information that would help back those guidelines has been addressed in part, at least, by ecological restoration practice and science. And so the necessary work then is in demonstrating that what works for ecological restoration practitioners can work for farmers and ag landscapes. And asking these questions and doing the studies that answer those questions sort of reinforces the practice of ecological restoration as well. So what influences successful ecological outcomes when it comes to these types of plantings? Well, seed mix design is one of the biggest determinants of outcomes and project costs in prairie reconstruction. Um, One aspect of seed mix design that's particularly influential here is the grass-to-forb seeding ratio, based on the number of seed sown, not the weight. Um, and so, from a cost perspective, seed mixes with a high grass-to-forb ratio tend to be a lot less expensive than seed mixes with a low grass-to-forb ratio, because grass seed is generally less expensive than forb seed. But designing a mix in which the seeding rate of one functional group is either too high or too low, that can have potentially some adverse effects on specific ecological outcomes. So, for example, seed mixes where the grass seeding rate is too high can produce grass-dominated stands where forbs establish poorly and don't persist long term. And ultimately, those stands don't have a lot of value as pollinator habitat. Conversely, seed mixes in which the grass seeding rate is too low might produce stands with lower cover, which are highly susceptible to weed invasion, and provide less protection against soil erosion and water quality degradation. Timing of seeding. That's another. It's another one that's also at the top of the list as a factor that's both able to determine ecological performance, and also importantly something that's relatively easy to implement. So most prairie reconstructions are seeded during either the spring, April to June, or in the dormant season, November to March. Um, for CRP plantings, usually, at least in Iowa, the dormant season begins November 15th, and the spring season stops July 1st. Um, so for many species, particularly forbs, cold moist stratification for 60 to 90 days is necessary to break dormancy and allow those seeds to germinate. And while most of those conditions for dormancy breaking are met when we're doing dormant planting, it's going to be pretty rare in growing season plantings. Now, on the other side, the seeds are exposed for longer periods of time with dormant seeding, um, which does mean that there's more opportunity for predation and seed loss. And we know from some studies that other folks at UNI have done that that can be a pretty significant amount. So interestingly, there's a really big disconnect in techniques between farmers who plant CRP and conservation professionals from NGOs and government. So overwhelmingly, at least based on a survey that we did as in a different project as part of the CP42 pollinator planting seed mix analysis, um, farmers are planting April through June 86% of the time. Now, on the other hand, around 80% of NGO and government managers are using dormant seeding when they're planting prairie, at least based on that Tricks of the Trade paper from 2010. So, is one way better than the other? And what are the implications of doing things this way? Forest year management can also influence costs and outcomes. Fast growing annual weeds are almost always a problem in post-agricultural sites. And if the annual weeds establish and become dominant before the prairie seeds germinate, can reduce establishment diversity and increase long-term management costs. Previous research done by my predecessor here at the Tallgrass Prairie Center showed that mowing promotes establishment by increasing light availability, and that increased significantly the seedling survival. And again, there's a bit of a disconnect in technique between farmers who are planting CRP, conservation professionals from NGOs and the government. Farmers are essentially always mowing the first year. On the other hand, still a majority, but a much smaller percentage, about 60% of NGO government managers are mowing. So, is mowing really necessary, or should more practitioners consider mowing? So, our research questions and objectives here were to one, investigate the design and implementation techniques that lead to establishment success in common CRP practices. Two, understand how consistent those techniques are in producing successful ecological outcomes. So today, I'm mostly going to present data from a recent publication in restoration ecology, specifically this paper led by a recent UNI master student, Alec Glidden, who's now working on his PhD at K-State. So to get at our research questions, we established a series of field experiments. So we initially began with an experiment located at ISU's Northeast Research Farm in Nashua, Iowa, and that was started in 2015. We then replicated that design and added an additional treatment to another experiment that was established in 2018. So that was at Cedar Falls, and throughout the talk, I'll be referring to the first experiment as NE or Nashua, and the newer experiment as CF or Cedar Falls. So talk about the experimental design of these experiments. We followed a blocked split plot design. We looked at 3 implementation techniques: seed mix, mowing, and planting season. At both of the experiments, we looked at 3 seed mix treatments that varied primarily in grass-to-forb ratio. We planted a forb-dominated pollinator mix, which was high cost, a grass-forb balanced diversity mix, which was moderate cost, and a grass-dominated economy mix, which was low cost. And they all sort of mimicked relevant CRP practices, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Um, we also looked at a mowing treatment where we either did no mowing the first year or kept the stand mowed to 5 inches throughout the first year, which more or less was monthly. And that was also applied to both experiments. And then finally, we looked at 2 planting season treatments in the CF experiment, where we planted in the dormant season on November 15th and in the spring on April 28th. Now, both times we used a native seed drill, since that's typically what's readily available for farmers to rent. So here's the 3 seed mixes we compared. The overall seeding rate for the mixes, we standardized to 40 seeds per square foot, of course, to meet the typical specs for a lot of CRP plantings. The main difference was in how much was grass versus forbs. So we looked at an economy mix that was based on off-the-shelf mixes that met the specs for CP25, the rare and declining habitat practice, which was mostly grasses, and it had a 3-to-1 grass-to-forb ratio. So 30 seeds per square foot grass, 10 for forbs. Not very diverse, only 21 species. Back in 2015, the mix cost $130 an acre. But I'm sure if you've bought seed in the last couple of years, you know these are probably not going to reflect the current practice or the current prices that are out there. So you can assume that the costs have gone up a good amount. But the relative differences in costs are about the same. We also looked at a diversity mix, which was a balanced mix with a 1-to-1 grass-to-forb ratio. Again, 20 seeds per square foot grass, 20 forbs. This one was quite diverse, 71 species. And those were selected for mesic soils, which matched our planting site and were native to eastern Iowa. This mix or variation of this mix is the one that we generally use for demonstration sites with the Prairie on Farms program. So, a lot of forbs and lots of different grass species, which include sedges. This one reflects most of the guidelines for the CP43 prairie strips practice, though it does have more species than a typical off-the-shelf mix would, like the other mixes. And lastly, we looked at a pollinator mix, which had the 1-to-3 grass-to-forb ratio, as specified by CP42 pollinator habitat practice standards. Again, this one was also modeled on a off-the-shelf mix. Another thing that the pollinator program specifies is a preference for short grasses. And most of our short grasses that are commercially available are dry adapted species like June grass or wet adapted like fox sedge. So this mix was not really tailored for the mesic soils on our sites, but it does represent the kinds of mixes that have been popular over the past couple of years. So we collected data from these 2 experiments from their initial establishment up including of this year or last year. But to standardize our analysis, we're going to focus on the year 2 data. That's the data that the paper's focused on too. So the results we'll talk about today will represent establishing prairie plantings in their second growing season. We'll mostly look at results from the CF experiment, but we'll also compare results between experiments towards the end. Now, to quantify ecological benefits and treatments, we measured some key vegetation metrics in each experimental plot. So to estimate erosion control, we looked at sown native stem density and native canopy cover. To estimate weed resistance, we looked at canopy cover of annual and perennial weeds, as well as bare ground cover. And then to measure pollinator resources, we looked at inflorescence density and floral richness. So just to give everyone an idea of what these prairies look like, I'll show some photos taken in July during their fourth growing season. So that was the most recent one for the CF experiment. The national one at this point is in year 7, but this is a photograph of year 4. So this is a forb-dominated pollinator mix in both experiments. Nashua experiment on the top and Cedar Falls on the bottom. Here's the diversity mix, that balanced seed mix. Again, Nashua on top, Cedar Falls on the bottom. And then the grass-dominated economy mix here. And to give a little context about the mowing treatments, so this is what a typical mow, no mow plot in July the first year looked like at Cedar Falls. The annual weed component was different at Nashua, mostly foxtail. It was not nearly as extreme visually in this photo. While we're on the topic of first year plantings and mowings, I like to try to help folks understand the drastic changes in visual appearance that you get from the first year compared to more established plantings. Since a lot of people will really panic when they see an establishing prairie planting that looks like this. So this is one of the pollinator plots looked like in its first growing season. This plot was not touched after this photo was taken, totally dominated by giant ragweed. And after several years, this plot, these are photo points. So this is the photo or the camera was in the same spot. And after several years, that looks quite different. And I think most folks listening today, this might not be that shocking, but for people who have worked in annual crop systems their entire lives, this situation where annual weeds just kind of go away, it's really hard to believe for them. And while the result is not necessarily stellar compared to outcomes in other treatments that we'll see, it's worth pointing out that this is not a failure, and it can help reinforce the importance of seedling ID and first year monitoring. Because despite the appearance of complete competitive exclusion, we did measure a small but decent amount of native plants under the closed canopy of ragweed. So that was a little digression, but let's go back to some of the data and look at the results. Okay, so we're going to be looking at a series of similar graphs here. So let's orient ourselves. On the y-axis, we have stem density broken out into native grasses on the left and native forbs on the right graph. The responses are grouped primarily by seed mix, which is on the x-axis, and then further by planting season, denoted by triangles, which are dormant planted, or circles, which are spring planted. And then mowing by open, mowed, or filled, unmowed shapes. And significant differences between the seed mixes are noted by the letters. So what we found is that stem density was generally affected by seed mix and mowing treatments, but not planting time. As you'd expect, the grass-dominated economy mix had the highest graminoid stem density, and the forb-dominated pollinator mix had the lowest. For forbs, the diversity in pollinator mixes had the most forb stems compared to the economy mix. And then with mowing, mowed subplots had higher graminoid and forb density than unmowed subplots. Now, while planting time did not influence overall stem density in either grasses or forbs, it did influence functional group composition, and we're going to look at that a little bit in depth later. Okay, so looking at weed resistance, we found that seed mix, mowing, and planting time all affected some aspect of weed and bare ground cover. So here, from left to right, we're looking at perennial weed cover, annual and biennial weed cover, and bare ground cover. With seed mixes, the grass-dominated economy mix had the lowest annual weed cover, but otherwise seed mix was not having a huge effect with annual weeds um, or perennial weeds. Um, Now with mowing, uh, we found that annual weed cover was reduced and bare ground cover was reduced. And with dormant season planting, you can't quite see that very well with this graph, but it did reduce perennial weed and bare ground cover um, as far as the statistics were concerned. Um, so taking a look at pollinator resources, we can see that, again, seed mix, mowing, and planting time all affected floral abundance, which is the left graph, and richness, floral richness, the right graph in some way. So with seed mixes, the forb-dominated pollinator mix did produce the most inflorescences, but the balanced diversity mix produced the most floral richness. Um, and then mowing increased both inflorescence production and floral richness, and dormant season planting increased floral richness as well by quite a bit. Okay, so in earlier graphs, we saw that planting time didn't tend to influence native plant density. However, it did influence the density of functional groups. So now we're going to break out plant density by graminoids and forbs, and then further by phenological functional groups within those. So here we're looking at how native grasses are affected by planting time. Um, on the y-axis, again, stems per square meter, um, and then x-axis gives us our functional groups. Stars indicate significant differences between treatments. So in grasses, we're seeing that when planting in the spring, we get higher abundance of warm season grasses at the expense of cool season grasses and sedges, and the opposite when planting in the dormant season. More cool season grasses and sedges at the expense of warm season grasses. As we can see when looking at the combined grass data, there's not really a real difference when you look at grass overall. Okay, so now let's look at forbs. So again, a similar graph, forb stems per square meter on the y-axis and different forb functional groups on the x-axis. And here we're seeing a range of responses. So when we're planting in the dormant season, we get more spring forbs and fall forbs. But when spring planting, we tend to get more legumes. So for the most abundant group, the summer forbs, we found that planting season really doesn't make too big of a difference. And again, when we looked at overall forb density, not a big difference in season of planting. And then we drilled down a little bit more on the pollinator mix to look at community composition in those plots, since yeah, you know, the abundance of different forbs throughout the growing seasons quite important in those uh, practice specifications and objectives. So here's the NMDS of plant community composition in dormant season and spring planted pollinator mix plots. You can see a pretty defined clustering based on planting time, with dormant seeded plots towards the top and spring seeded plots towards the bottom. These vectors that you're seeing are showing species with Pearson correlations to the NMDS greater than 0.4. And then we did some further analysis with Permanova and showed that, statistically, those make sense, that planting time does have a statistically significant effect on community composition in the pollinator mix. And then further, we looked at species driving the differences, and we found that the species favored by dormancies and planting included a variety of sedge species, since we couldn't, when we were doing the surveys, we were not at times when you could identify different sedges necessarily. June grass, prairie blazing star, stiff goldenrod, a variety of aster species, and golden alexander. And then those favored by spring planting included big blue stem, both the prairie clover species, wild bergamot, gray-headed coneflower, black-eyed Susan, little blue stem, and composite drop seed. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at our second overall objective, looking at ecological outcome consistency. So now we're looking at how consistent the effects of implementation techniques were. So this table is showing the impact of seed mix on ecosystem service provision in the two different experiments. So for each site, natural or CF, the seed mix with the highest value for each variable is scored as 100% and highlighted. And other seed mixes are scored as a relative proportion of the highest value. So for example, in the first row for erosion control and sown cover, the economy mix produced the highest cover in both experiments, with the diversity mix producing 89% of the cover that the economy mix produced in the Nashua experiment, and 88% of the cover that the economy mix produced in the CF experiment. And then so on and so forth for each variable and experiment site. So basically, more similar numbers between experiments within each mix shows more consistency of effect. So what we see when we take all this together is that the differences in ecosystem service provision between seed mixes were generally pretty comparable between the two experiments. The economy mix was best at sown cover and stem density in both sites, whereas the diversity mix excelled the same way at bare ground absence and floral richness. And the pollinator mix consistently produced the most flowers in both experiments. Then if we take a look at mowing, we found that the differences in ecosystem service provision between mowing treatments were also relatively comparable between the experiments. General erosion control, weed resistance, and pollinator resources were higher in the mown subplots than unmown subplots at both sites. The only situation where that did not occur, was not consistent, was absence of bare ground. Okay, so let's summarize here what we've learned so far. So in order to maximize establishment success, we found that one, designing seed mixes with a balanced amount of grasses and forbs produces most of the benefits of a grass or forb dominated seed mix. Two, that first year mowing accelerates the provision of nearly all ecosystem services that we looked at. And three, that dormant seeding improves some aspects of weed resistance and pollinator resources, namely fewer perennial weeds and more spring and fall forb abundance. We also found that the effects of these implementation techniques, specifically seed mix and first year mowing, are predictable and pretty consistent between sites, even when they're planted in different years, and the absolute density of the measures are different. Generally speaking, I think pretty much all of the design and management choices led to viable stands. It really was only unmowed spring seedings that had sort of consistently marginal outcomes compared with the others. So we're talking about success in terms of degrees, and not success in terms of success versus failure. So by and large, most of these plantings were and some degree of successful. Okay, so what can we take away from this study? One takeaway, I think, is that something well established in the ecological restoration practice and the literature, that dormant seeding generally produces the best results. Does work well when applied to CRP plantings in ag landscapes. Um, and it makes sense to push the adoption of more dormant seeding, um, especially where pollinator habitat objectives are important. Um, the existing way of doing things with farmers planting in the spring is maybe leading to some lost opportunities in terms of making sure that all three parts of the growing season produce floral resources. So, this means more training, more field days, updated guidelines. On the other hand, one of the strengths of the existing practice of farmers is the ubiquity of establishment mowing, or at least what we found. Um, and that's a set of guidelines that's already in the existing practice there. But given that nearly half of ecological restoration practitioners don't use establishment mowing, our results suggest it might be worth considering, given the improvement that mowing had on a wide range of benefits. Of course, our results here are going to lose salience as one moves further west, since the ability of annual weeds to capture resources that first year kind of diminishes going that direction. So probably this is mostly relevant to the central and eastern tallgrass prairie regions. And then I think another thing we can do is try to improve the seed mix specs for a few of the popular native vegetation CRP programs, so that resulting stands will be more multifunctional, which is to say, providing more benefits at once. A more balanced mix with equal grass-to-forb seeding rates and a lot of different functional groups performs about as well for pollinators. So that's ticking the boxes for pollinator objectives. But it also resists weeds and provides high native cover for more general wildlife and cover objectives. So perhaps with some more added guide rails, it could provide a basis for consolidating kind of the myriad programs with similar objectives that are, really other ways of saying tallgrass prairie reconstruction. So to start wrapping things up here, I'll just briefly discuss a couple other cool things coming out of this research. First, the results we talked about today are showing up at least a little bit in policy recommendations, new publications from the USDA, like this tech that came out last year, now specifically recommends establishment mowing and balanced seed mix design for prairie strips. We've also partnered with the Iowa State University Strips team, Pheasants Forever, to establish several additional on-farm research and demonstration sites throughout Iowa, on which we've hosted quite a few in-person and virtual field days that have reached hundreds of ag conservation professionals as well as farmers. And while I only had time to present one study today, we've done and continue to do other research on prairie implementation and prairie restoration ecology topics. So if you're interested, we have several technical reports covering today's topic, but also some others that cover some related topics like prairie seeding depth, seed mix cost effectiveness, and more. So you can find those on our Research and Restoration Program website, which is posted on the slide here. And with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators and funders, Alec Glidden, who first author on this paper and did a lot of work to get this done, Mark Sherrard, Mark Myers, Kenneth Algersma, and the folks at ISU Strips team, and Ken Pekanowski at the ISU Northeast Research Farm. And I'm going to leave it at that and open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Justin. This was a really great and informative talk, and hopefully we'll will continue to will help inform better reconstruction practice out there on the ground and in the field. So please go ahead and type your questions into the chat if you have them, or you may use the raise hand function, and I'll see you and Colin, you can mute yourself. And so Amanda has a question here in the chat. I would like to think it would be easy to get farmers to adopt dormant season prairie seeding, since it wouldn't take away from their time in the spring for their regular farming activity. Do you think it is just habit that causes most to sow prairie in the spring, or is it because of agency guidance?
All right. Yes. Good question. I think it's a little bit of both. I think there's a lot of folk wisdom that, the best time to plant prairies after you plant, corn or beans or whatever you're working on. And it kind of, I think sometimes kind of the back of the pile, sometimes like that. But the other potential barrier that I've heard farmers talk about is the kind of the quick turnaround a lot of the times for, if you sign up for if you finally get approval for enrolling into these programs at the end of September, which is, I believe, pretty typical. You only have a couple of months to get prepared, and sometimes that can be too quick of a turnaround to come up with a seed mix, send that out for bids, or if you're doing that, or find get the whole process of seed mix design going, and getting the seed and getting everything ready, lining up a drill. That can be kind of a big task to do in those couple months. So I think, yeah, considering those barriers in the making the pitch, I think is helpful. But yeah, like you said, it shouldn't be too hard. I think it's very doable. Yeah.
Thank you, Justin. Ian asks, maybe I missed it, but what was the timing of the mowing treatments?
So we mowed roughly every month. So the timing was based on the height of the vegetation. So um, so I forget the exact centimeter designation, but whatever that is, that's roughly knee high. I mean, we did actually measure it to make our decisions, but that was the general idea, was to mow each time the vegetation reached about knee high, which I couldn't tell you what this. I couldn't convert that to metric, but it's in the paper if you want the exact number. But for most of us, knee high, keeping it mowed to about 5 inches every time the vegetation gets knee high, which at least in our years was about each month, starting in mid-May.
Okay, thanks, Justin. Paula asked, have you researched mowing versus chemical control?
So we have not. Depending on the objectives and the seed mix, very specifically, chemical control in an already planted prairie probably wouldn't yield very good results, I'm guessing. With mowing, you really have zero off-target effects on the native plants. With chemical control, you're going to have some off-target effects. I mean, I know that there's plateau-ready mixes, but you really have to restrict your species that you would put in a mix to something that might not really meet a lot of ecological objectives. So I generally don't suggest going that route, but um, it still costs. It's a lot. It's not saving money, and it's not really producing any. I guess we don't know for sure, but it's hard to imagine that. Um, just to get back to basics, what we're doing that first year is just creating more light for seedlings. And if we can do it with mowing that we know has no off-target effects, I think that's a good approach. Um, so that would be what my suggestion is.
Okay, very, very good. Thanks, Justin. Mark asked about the number of species in mix per site. And Mark, if you want to clarify, or Justin, you can go ahead and try to
Sure.
answer.
I'll bring this up here. So so these are the 3 seed mixes that we used. Um, they were the same seed mixes that we used at both sites. So um, obviously they were purchased in different years, and so they were different lots, but the species composition of the mixes was the same, and the density of each species sown was. And so yeah, the economy mix had about 20, the pollinator mix about 40, and the diversity mix about 70.
Okay, again, Paula was also asking mowing impact to seeded shrubs, only first year mowing or mowing multiple years. I don't know if Paula wants to clarify on that question, because I don't think there were any no woody species planted, was there?
We did seed Morpha.
Oh, okay.
We seeded lead plant, but I think it has such a hard time establishing um, into significant densities, at least here, that we wouldn't have been able to look at that anyway. Um, but yeah, I mean, that does bring up possible um, impacts to woody species. Mowing is not good for woody species generally.
Right.
Uh,
And then for your treatments, you were just mowing just the first year, or in subsequent years?
yes, this is only mowing for the first year. That's
Okay.
right.
Okay.
After year 2, no treatments were applied.
Okay, very good. Christine asked, do you think there would be benefit to stagger seeding over multiple seasons the first year to optimize species success? For example, to match the season in which particular species are more successful. For instance, your NMDS figure suggests Monarda is spring favored versus Carex was dormant favored.
Yes, that is a great idea, and something that I hope to be able, whether I look at it or one of you guys, but it's definitely something interesting. I think could have a lot of promise. The only thing that I consider that would prevent us from doing something like that um, is the costs associated with basically doing a whole other seating. So the establishment benefits from a per plant cost per plant idea would have to outweigh the cost per acre to mow or to plant again. So so that's kind of the place where I think the question is and the research is. I think it could. I bet it will. Um, I think it's. But yeah, a great idea, and something I hope someone looks at.
Well, looks like Christine works up in Hennepin County in Minnesota, and would like to work with you to test that idea. So I'll let you guys do some communication offline. That would be great. Ian asked, was any treatment somewhat associated with lead plants? Seemed like spring favored legumes, but wasn't certain if that was entirely due to dahlia.
Yeah, so that's my guess. The thing we run into with lead plant is because it has such low establishment success, it's hard to observe. And so when we don't have enough observations, we can't really ask the question. So um, or we can't really test it. So based on the success of other legumes, it wasn't just dahlia either. Um, uh, this is what I'm saying here is now not, this is all observation at this point. I don't think we have statistics to back up what I'm about to say yet, but I've definitely noticed that desmodium, and I do know that there is a paper that shows that. I forget who wrote that one. It's a good paper, but yeah, desmodium is spring favored. And so, yeah, I would assume based on the general tendency of legumes to prefer spring seeding that lead plant would also benefit from that. Um, so that's yeah, a good question though. Lead plants, we all want it. It's hard to get.
Right, right. Leah asked, she's they're following up on a comment to Christine's question. Perhaps the species composition differences aren't surprising? Question mark. Spring planting favors species that don't need stratification, like Monarda, and fall planting favors species that do need stratification.
Yes. So one thing I'll point out is that when we say that species need stratification, typically it's a matter of degree. Some things like you can talk about the different kinds of dormancy that you see expressed in the species that we're working with. Um, for example, the carrot family has a different kind of dormancy that it's a pretty hard requirement for cold moist stratification. You don't get a little bit of establishment if you seed it in the spring. You simply have to wait until it's gone through a cold moist stratification cycle the next year. Um, so I think so yes, it is. It's not surprising, but it is good to show it experimentally, and it's good to put some numbers to that. Um, so yeah, that would be my response.
Okay, thanks, Justin. I'll looks like there's no more questions in the chat. I'll ask a final question. It was really striking to see, the differences in treatment responses or what seemingly came from the initials, the seed mix design that seemed to show a very, very strong response. Have you or your colleagues there found an upper limit or lower limit to seeding rate, say calculated seeds per square foot that leads to, success or leads to one of those goals, set out that you were measuring as part of this experiment?
Yeah, so that is a really good question. We have not looked at it as far as seeding rate, and that really is a pretty important question. We're talking about cost, and um, so yeah, I don't know. There is a good. So I keep talking about this paper that's good, and I'm trying to look it up right now. Um, but they did look at not, they are not associated with Tallgrass Prairie Center, but My goodness, maybe if I'm not sure how to send that info to folks later, but there, if you look at in Google Scholar and look at tallgrass prairie seeding density experiments, um, there are a couple good ones out there, and there does seem to be, at least when we're looking at seed mix, sowing seed mixes at an overall density, it does seem to have kind of 40 seeds per square foot seems to be a good compromise. You start to
Mhm.
you start to lose the um, that linear relationship. It kind of flattens out a little over that. So I'm going to leave it at that because I could talk all day about
Well, and
the different.
that number's in my head too, right? And I pulled that, right out of the Daryl Smith and colleagues book,
Yeah,
from the Tallgrass Prairie Center, and so that number seems to be out there, but I didn't know if there's been any, how strong that is, particularly when it comes to balancing the needs of resources, available. Oh, looks like folks want to, Justin, if you're still willing to stay on the line for another minute, looks like there's a couple more questions that have come in.
yeah,
So,
that sounds great.
can you share your thoughts of the potential results of less mowing operations, that is, one mowing early? I wonder if multiple mowings limit the forb seed development in year one and subsequent establishment.
Um, let's see. So with that, we don't have too many instances where we do that. Um, but I will say, going back to that work that my Dave Williams, my predecessor, did looking at really intensive mowing that first year. It's the rate of growth and the timing for the germination for the forbs typically is really slow. I mean, it's pretty slow, and they don't seem to be adversely impacted when they're mowed. I
Mm,
guess the one situation where I've seen potentially uh, troubling results is during drought years, where it seems like the added light actually just kind of stresses the seedlings more.
mm,
But I guess I haven't experienced, and I don't know of data that shows that mowing is detrimental to establishing seedlings. So, um,
mm.
but again, the kind of the fundamental idea is that getting more light to the surface for the seedlings is more important than you know most everything else.
Okay, very, very good. Thank you. One last question from Nathan. Any thoughts or plans on examining the role of prescribed fire in maximizing prairie establishment and reducing weed competition, along with using dormant seed planting and mowing?
Yeah, it's a great idea. The only reason I think that we haven't looked at it within this context is that it is tough to convince farmers to burn.
Mm,
So if s- as long as you have enough fuel and the dormant everything, all the forbs, everything, as long as your seedlings are dormant, I mean, theoretically, shouldn't have too big of a impact on, from burning on your natives. And, thinking about the
mm,
impacts of burning or the results of burning, why it's beneficial is similar to mowing, with the added benefit of, burning in the spring, you get the black soil, you get faster
mm.
warm up, things start growing faster. So, um, yeah, it's an interesting question. But I don't know of any other work that's been done on that, at least in prescribed burning on the really early end of things.
Okay. And with that, thank you very much, Justin, for your time and talent and sharing your knowledge and research with us today. If folks, well, if folks would like to get a hold of you, may they contact you at the Tallgrass Prairie Center?
Yeah, definitely. My contact info should be on the website. Otherwise, do I have a? Don't have a slide here, but um,
Okay.
justin.meissen@uni.edu is my email. So that's a good way to get a hold of me.
Okay. Very, very good.